Joining us now is Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. He is a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Sir, is your head spinning from the last 72 hours of information that has come to light that I think largely corroborates a lot of the information you already had, but it's just more detail, more flesh on the bones, if you will?
Yeah, it does. And I'm sort of reflecting on this, Ali. You know, I mean, it's a revelation a day or a revelation a week. I mean, remember, it was just, 4 weeks ago or so that Sondland came before us and told the story only because he was forced to, of the phone call that he had with the president, in which the president asked him about the investigation. And, there's just revelation after revelation, but it gets mixed up in all of these characters like Rob Hyde and, all these sort of colorful characters that we sort of lose the line. And the line that we can't lose here, Ali, is that every single fact, and believe me, I'm acquainted with all of them, having been on the investigation from the beginning, points to some really serious misbehavior that the Senate cannot possibly say we have all the facts without talking to Mike Pompeo, without talking to the chief of staff, without talking to Rudy Giuliani. If the Senate says, gosh, we've heard enough, we don't need to talk to those people, it will be one of the most irresponsible moments in American history, because as you point out, every single day there is new and incriminating evidence.
But the senators are not blind to this information. Whether or not they hear it in the Senate, whether or not it's these witnesses are called or the documents are subpoenaed, the Senate is not blind to the conversation that is going on around us, which indicate that the president has been involved in some serious misdeeds. At what point does the chicken come home to roost? At what point do they have to say, we cannot avoid this any longer?
Well, I mean, there's a really disappointing answer to that question that just reflects the extent to which the country has become tribal in its politics. But more importantly than that, the extent to which Donald Trump and the Republican Party have really become a cult. You know, you're going to hear about the same 3 or 4 senators who are in, non-Trumpy areas who will, occasionally show flashes of impartiality. But every other senator is going to consider the fact that if they turn against Donald Trump, chiefly amongst them, by the way, Mitch McConnell, who is up for re-election in November, if they turn against Donald Trump, regardless of the facts. We go back to shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue and there being no consequences. That if they turn against Donald Trump, they lose a primary. And very, very sadly, despite the overwhelming evidence, and Ali, you've been watching this too, you know that at no point really have the Republicans engaged with the body of evidence. What they do is they say, well, Adam Schiff is a bad guy. The Government Accounting Office, which yesterday said, we haven't even talked about this, yesterday said that the administration broke the law. Well, the Government Accounting Office, it probably has Democrats in it. I mean, It's just, sadly, it's reflective of the fact that the Republicans now are completely enthralled, almost in a religious way, to Donald Trump.
Lev Parnas called it a cult. But even when you say it's tribal, I mean, tribes change their leaders. This doesn't do away with the tribe of Republicans to say that Donald Trump has done things incorrectly. I'm a little puzzled by that. But let's talk about Devin Nunes for a second, because you were just talking about Adam Schiff. What do you make of this communication that puts Lev Parnas in proximity to Devin Nunes?
Yeah, well, sadly, it's not a surprise, and I've watched Devin Nunes since the day that Jim Comey came before our committee a year and a half, 2 years ago, and announced the investigation into the president. From that moment on, Devin Nunes became attorney, advocate, private investigator on behalf of the president. And this goes way back to when Devin Nunes was trying to run a sort of one-man investigative campaign of trying to hunt down the Steele dossier sources and this sort of thing. And big picture here, and look, he embarrassed himself, right? I mean, as you know, a couple of weeks ago when he was asked about this, he denied really having any memory of Lev Parnas. It turns out, of course, he did. He had an 8-minute conversation with the guy. So he's damaged his own credibility. And what he's done to the country is, rather than being what the Constitution would have him be, which is a check and a balance on the president, he, of course, has become an advocate and a fighter for the president. And that's a huge problem and further evidence of the extent to which the Republican Party has become a cult in support of Donald Trump.
Well, let's see what happens in the next few weeks, Congressman, whether or not this piling on of evidence moves anybody to do the thing that the Constitution calls upon them to do. Congressman, good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.